All right, I will get us started then if everyone's all set. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Find Your Ancestors session for today. I'm Katie Stilp. I'm the local history librarian here at Appleton Public Library in Appleton, Wisconsin. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for our webinar on identifying and interpreting historic photos. Before we dive into our program, I just have a couple quick announcements. First, a huge thank you to the Friends of the Appleton Public Library for providing funding for our Find Your Ancestors series and allowing us to bring such amazing speakers every month. We couldn't do it without their support. For those unfamiliar with the Find Your Ancestors series, this actually happens once a month, every month of the year. So definitely check out the handout on the first page. We have links to our future programs that you can definitely register for them. They're going to be on Zoom for quite a while yet, so feel free to join us. Our next session is going to be November 12th at 2 p.m. Central, and we'll be on researching Native American ancestors. Then we're going to wrap up the year by doing a big DNA workshop in December, where we're going to have two back-to-back sessions, both on DNA. And then I have a few of our 2023 topics and dates listed in the handout, and there's more on the events calendar and more coming soon, so stay tuned. Just a reminder, even if you register for those programs today, you will get a reminder email 1 week, 1 day, and 1 hour before the programs from Zoom with that link to join the program. So even if you sign up for it today and forget for 2 months that you signed up for it, we're sending you a reminder email. If you missed any of our past programs, we have recorded some of them and posted them on our YouTube channel. There's a link to that in the handout. Of course, not every presentation is recorded or up there indefinitely, so be sure to register and attend live if you're able to do so. We are recording today's session and I'll send out a link to the video recording to everyone in a few days. If you have any questions during today's session, you can use the Q&A box located on the bottom of your screen, and we'll answer questions at the end. Closed captioning is also enabled if you need it. You're able to push that button at the bottom of your screen. Just be aware, because it is a live transcript, it's not 100% accurate. If you have any library-specific questions or need help navigating any of our library's genealogy databases, feel free to reach out to me. My email address is in that first page of the handout. I also offer one-on-one sessions via Zoom to help with any genealogy questions or show you the genealogy databases. So if you're interested in those, definitely feel free to reach out and we can book an appointment. Then finally, at the end of today's session, we have a short survey from Project Outcome, which is an American Library Association sponsored initiative. If you could just take a minute and fill it out for us, we'd really appreciate letting us know what you thought of today's program. And there's also a spot on there where you can let us know what future topics you'd like us to tackle in this Find Your Ancestors series. So without further ado, let me introduce our speaker today. Today we have Tina Beaird. She is the owner of Tamarack Genealogy and is also a genealogy local history librarian at the Plainfield Area Public Library in Plainfield, Illinois. She lectures extensively on topics including Scottish resources, military research, and archival preservation. She's a member of the Genealogical Speakers Guild and the Association of Professional Genealogists, as well as the first vice president of the Illinois State Genealogical Society and director for the Oswego Land Heritage Association. She volunteers her time with several historical and genealogical societies across Illinois, and she has provided research assistance for nearly 25 years and has been researching her family's history as time permits for over 30 years. She's also a really big baseball fanatic, and she and her family has visited 23 out of the 30 major league ballparks. So everyone, welcome Tina.
Thank you so much. I'm actually up to 24 because we knocked off Toronto last month. So we're almost there. I will admit I was watching the Tampa Bay Cleveland Guardians game before we started today. So I'll be excited to see how that turned out. So thank you all for being here with me today. I'm delighted to be able to present a presentation for you on identifying and interpreting historic photos. In this front slide that we see, this is my grandma Nellie, and this is my mom, Pat. My family is from Wisconsin, so they were from Fond du Lac County, they were from Taycheedah, and we are Middletons, so we have a connection to Middleton, Wisconsin as well. We're going to talk about all of the different layers that are associated with looking at historic photographs, both eras and clothing styles and props and things like that. And because of that, I'm going to turn my camera off, one, to save bandwidth, because technology is not always my friend. And 2, so that you can see my full screen, so that you can get a good look at some of these images that I'm going to share. And then I'll turn my camera back on for the Q&A. So let's get started. So where do we begin? What types of things should we be thinking about or looking for when we're trying to date our photographs? I'm pretty sure every single one of us has, wound up with a box of unidentified photos that might have been passed to you from an aunt or an uncle or, a cousin or a grandparent of some kind. We all think we're never going to forget who it is in the photo. So we don't always think to jot down the people that we're most familiar with, the places we would vacation, the pets we might have had. And then the years go past and we struggle to remember, or unfortunately, somebody passes away and that information is lost. I was lucky enough that my grandma, not my grandma Nellie, but my grandma on my dad's side, lived to be 92 years old. And before she passed away, I was going through photographs with her and we were looking at her wedding album. And I said, Grandma, I don't recognize a couple of these guys who were in the wedding party. Who are they? And she says, oh, I don't remember. They were friends of your grandfather's. And I thought, oh, that just cracks me up because even she can't remember the people who were in her wedding party. Granted, it was a larger wedding party, but it happens. The biggest events in our lives, sometimes over time, just become hazy. So do yourself a favor. Do your children and your descendants and your family a favor. And even if you can't remember everybody or every place, jot them down because it's going to come in handy. So if you don't have that, if you weren't lucky enough that that information was passed down, how do you break it up? How do you start to begin that process of dating and identifying photos? So you could do it a couple of different ways. If you're dealing with loose photographs, somebody just hands you a box and it's not in any particular order, then I would probably begin to split it up into eras. So what does that mean? Black and whites from color photographs, right? Simple, easy identification process. And then it might be something like, I recognize this as being the 1940s based on the hairstyles or the cars or the clothing, and 1960s or 1890s. You can kind of ballpark. You don't have to be perfect, but you're starting to break them up into categories. If they are put together in albums, I would not do this. I would leave the albums exactly the way that they are put together because you don't necessarily know who the people might be or the order in which they were put in the album, but there's a rhyme and a reason to albums. Typically, people are either doing them chronologically, by event, or just naturally by date. They're doing them by event, wedding album, a baby book, or something like that. Or they might be doing them based on family groups. So these 8 pages are all, Aunt Judy's family. These 8 pages are all Uncle Bob's family. These 8 pages are all, Aunt Margaret's family. So if you're dealing with albums, keep them together for now. Do not take them apart. I'll give you a couple of examples towards the end of ideas and ways that you can begin to identify them, but don't disassemble them. If they're already loose, it's a little easier to begin breaking them up into country and city. These are obviously taken on a farm or in the countryside. These are taken in the city. Again, by era. You could do it by clothing style. You can do it by location. If there happens to be street names or photographer's marks or something that identifies it as a particular place, put it into that pile, into that category. But what if they're not? That's when you start to look at things. What do I see? What's in the background? What type of buildings, scenery, vehicles do we see? Can you read the names of businesses? Can you read street signs in the background? Is there some other type of identifying feature like a church or a courthouse or a bridge or something else that you recognize that you can then start to categorize those things? I love this photo. The young man in the photo is unidentified. This comes from an album. The album is still intact, but we can definitely tell that this is 1940s, maybe early 1950s, post-war community. This isn't out on a farm. This is in town somewhere. So you just begin to start to look for those details. If you're lucky enough that there's a photographer's name already on it, either on the back or you still have the casing or the frame that it came in, that's a huge help. Because even if you don't know specifically who the person is, you can start to date the photographs, and I'll go into more details in this at the very end, of identifying the person based on the photographer mark. what years was that photographer in business, and specifically at that location, because it was very common for photographers to move around from studio to studio. That's always a help. Things like the type of material that it's made out of. I'm going to go into this in more detail as well in a few minutes. You know, is it a tintype? Is it a cabinet card, a carte de visite? Is it a color print? Is it just a black and white salt print? All of those helps identify eras and periods as well. And then clothing. Sorry, guys, it is definitely harder to identify men's clothing styles than it is for women. Women have a tendency to change their fashion a lot more rapidly than men do. So usually in a 5 to 10 year period, you can find a distinguishing female outfit to ballpark more often than male clothing styles. They do not change as rapidly, but you definitely want to be looking at the clothing styles. So for example, it's a lot easier to identify a 1940s outfit or a 1920s flapper style dress and not mix it up with an 1840s style dress or men's suit. You can easily identify 1860s with the big full skirts and the tight button-down jackets versus the 1960s with the beehive hairdos and the A-line dresses and the tall boots. So you're kind of looking at roughly the type of clothing style by decade. It's not going to be necessarily perfect or specific, but you're going to look for identifying features that you recognize. So whether that's the 1970s and their bell bottoms, or it's the 19-teens with the high collared shirts and the big puffy sleeves, you're starting to kind of get a feel for what am I looking at? We'll talk a lot towards the end about photographers' backgrounds and props. There are certain things that can tie photos together. I'll definitely talk about what I call the ubiquitous chair that every photography studio on the planet seems to have over a 20-year period. But if I see that chair, then I can ballpark this to a particular date, not necessarily a location, but to a date range. So we're looking at backgrounds, we're looking at props, tables, chairs, scenery, like those ornate backgrounds. You'll see some of those in my slides as I'm talking. So we're looking for these kind of themes and these trends. Tax stamps, if you are lucky enough that you have a photograph that has a tax stamp on it. Tax stamps were used during the Civil War in the North for the Union to raise funds to help support the Union Army. It's not something that they were doing in Confederate states. It's not something that you're going to see in the South in that same period. But in the United States, between the summer of 1863 until the end of the war, they started to raise money on what they considered to be luxury goods. So photographs fell into that category of luxury goods, along with things like wagons and carriages, things like jewelry. Real estate was considered a luxury good and you paid a tax stamp. So you'll see a lot of property transactions that will show up that have a tax stamp on them. And photography was one of those as well. So the downside to tax stamps is that if you bought an album and let's say you sat for a photographer, there's 20 pictures in your album, only one of those would need the tax stamp, not every photo. So if you have an album that's still intact, you have to be very, very careful if you can slide the images out to find the one if you suspect it's in that era and might potentially have a tax stamp on it. Otherwise, if we're dealing with loose photos, it's kind of random because if somebody disassembles an album, only one of those is going to have the stamp. But the beauty of it is I have a slightly less than 2-year window to which I can identify. So this photo that we see here, this is of Jeanette Small Burkett. Jeanette was married for 18 months. She died shortly after childbirth, not because of childbirth, but because she had caught an illness and had succumbed to the illness that she had caught shortly after giving birth. So we didn't have a name for this particular person. 3 different people in the family all had this same photo. Nobody had the name on the back of it, but one family member had an album. And when we slid the photos out of the album, we struck gold. On the back of it was not only her name, but the tax stamp to identify that, yes, this is who she is. And we know this is her because we know that she died in August of 1865 and that this photo was taken sometime between 63 and 65. So we could confirm based on the name as well as the tax stamp. So if you're lucky enough to have it, it truly is a wonderful find. So there's a process that's done. We use this a lot in the archival world when we're dealing with historic photographs and when we digitize things. And it's called active seeing. So when you're writing up, you're digitizing items and you're getting them ready to be put up on a website or into some kind of digital collection. We need to be able to give the best, most detailed descriptions that we can so that those images are discoverable in a variety of different ways. That could be by rough time period. So we could roughly date them to a decade. It could be by location. We think these were done in the Midwest or Illinois or Spirit Lake, Iowa, rough location. And a lot of times it's based on description. So what are we seeing? What's going on in the photograph? So if somebody says, I'm looking for bonnets, we can write a descriptor that says, you know, this is an 1840s era Scottish bonnet. So that if I'm doing an online search, that becomes discoverable to me to be able to use that in my research or maybe, you know, in my family tree if it's a photo of my family. So the process of writing those descriptions, we use what's called active seeing. So instead of looking at a photo and saying, it's a couple, really reading the details to it. It's a studio portrait. It's potentially taken about 1920 to 1930. The man is wearing XYZ, pinstripe suit and brown shoes. The woman is wearing, and you give a description of it. Are they wearing wedding rings? Does she or he have jewelry on of any kind, or hats or accessories, gloves, scarves, something to help identify that image? What type of studio portrait is it? Is it a marriage photo? Is it a group photo? Is it a church gathering or a class photo? What do you see in the background? Are they inside or are they outside? Because you can have studio portraits taken outside. Is it a studio portrait or is it a candid? Is it something that's taken with a Brownie camera or some other type of personal camera? How many people are in the photo? This is great when you're dealing with families to help identify family groups, because you might have 7 people in the photo, what appears to be mom and dad, and then maybe either 4 children or 5 children and a grandparent. You know, how many people? How many men? How many women? How many are children? What are roughly their ages? So by saying this, and the best way to do it is to say it out loud, because you'll be amazed that you always notice more details when you say it out loud than if you're just glancing at the photo and writing it down. Believe it or not, I know it sounds crazy, but you'll notice more details when you say, oh, I see a pocket watch. Oh, she's wearing a wedding ring. Oh, I never noticed he had glasses on in this photo. And you'll begin to see details that could help you eventually identify this. It could be something like, oh, I recognize that pocket watch. It's been in the family for a number of years, or a table, or a dining set, or whatever it happens to be. You might recognize something in that photo, and by saying it out loud, it jars that memory. Or the people in the photo, it's taken out in the country. You can see they're out in front of their home. It looks like a farm. Do I know anybody who had 5 children, roughly about 1910 or roughly about 1880, that lived on a farm? And you're going to start to be able to categorize these into potentials. So here's a photo. I want you to take a look at it for about a minute. So I want you to really focus on the details of what you see. And I'm going to move away from it. And then I'm going to give you some of the things that I'm hoping you might have spotted in the process. So I'm going to let you take a look at that for a few seconds. Look at everything. Look at the foreground, look at the background, look at the vehicle. I'll give you a few more seconds to kind of absorb what you're seeing there. Okay. So now I'm going to move away from it. Don't focus on this one yet, because I want to talk about the last photo. So some of the things I'm hoping that you noticed when you looked at that first photo was the era that it was taken, the type of vehicle he was driving. So he's driving a gas truck, an oil truck for Johnson Oils. But if you looked at the style of the truck, if you looked at the pneumatic tires, we're dealing with a vehicle definitely before 1930. because they didn't have hard-sided tires. They still had pump-up tires like what you would see on a bicycle. If you had noticed, he was wearing a hat and he had gloves on. He had a jacket, but it wasn't a heavy winter jacket. It was like a business, like a company jacket that he was wearing. So we're dealing with either spring or fall. But if you had noticed the shop windows behind him, there was Albert's store, which was a haberdasher. It had the name of the company as well as the street address above it. So I could then go and look in city directories to see when was Albert's store in this location. Star Jewelers was also in the background that was visible, so I could look up Star Jewelers. But if we really want to figure out exactly what time period, like what time of year it was, there's one key feature that I hope you noticed. In the window of Albert's store, they're selling summer hats. They're selling their boaters. They're selling their straw hats. And you're not going to have those on display for sale in the fall. You're going to have those on sale in the spring because you're getting ready to start selling them for the season. So this photo tells me it's cold. He's wearing gloves. He has a hat on, but they're getting ready for summer because they're going into that season based on the hats that they're selling in the window. But again, look at those tires. Look at the type of vehicle he's driving. Look at the other companies in the background. It's a cobblestone, it's a brick street. So we know we're dealing with a town of some kind, a city or a town. It's not out in the country. So those are the types of details. Once you start to say them out loud, you start to see more and more throughout that process. So let's do it one more time. Let's do it with the next one. So take a quick look for a few seconds, and we're going to see what types of things that your eye picks out. Okay, so I'm going to move away from it. So it's a company of some kind. You have a bunch of employees who are working. We've got an office of some kind. We can see that. It's mixed. We have men and women who are working in the office of a range of ages. Most of them look to be fairly young, maybe 20s or 30s, but we do have some older employees of the company. You could see all the cubbies off to the right-hand side, all of the slots where they would put their information, their paperwork for the day into those slots. There were typewriters in the foreground. If you saw the old-fashioned black typewriters in the front, the hairstyles, the pin curl type hairstyles that you see there. So you could roughly age this photo. So if we go back again, in this album, the person who owned the album had told us this was the EJ&E car service, which was the Elgin Joliet and Eola railroad line. So these are all employees who work for the railroad. And on the photo itself, it's written 1927. That's actually false, which kind of cracks me up that the person probably forgot by the time they put the album together, because on the back wall, like you can see in the slide I just showed you, this was taken, the calendar says that it's October of 1926 and that you can read the time on the clock in the background. So you actively look at this photo and you recite these different things that you see. Even in this photo, you could see the old-fashioned fan hanging from the ceiling to keep the office cool. But sometimes those details are exactly what you need, an exact date, an exact time to tell you when that photo was taken. The beauty of this particular photo is that when you kind of tipped up, because only the two corners were glued in, not the whole photo. When you tip it up, all of the employees' names were written on the back side of this photo, which was absolutely amazing. But it's that process of active seeing. When you are looking and you're really looking for details, you're going to discover things that didn't necessarily jump out at you the first time you looked at it. So now let's talk about eras. What do I mean by eras? We're talking about those generic time periods. In this particular section is based on photography styles, photography types of images. So I'm only going to focus on a couple because we'd really get bogged down in this. But things like tintypes. Tintypes were really, really popular from roughly 1860 to 1880. You will still see some of those that linger in the years immediately following 1880. And they still make tintypes now. I mean, if you go to Branson, you can dress up I can't wait. These photos are going to confuse my descendants someday. You go to Branson and you get all gussied up in your Wild West outfit or your farmer outfit, and they take your picture on a tintype and they give it to you. Oh my goodness, I can only imagine the chaos this is going to cause someday for my descendants. So they still do it today, but the most common date range is between 1860 and 1885. Believe it or not, these were never tin at all. They were aluminum. And it was a reverse process. This is something that is very important and I want you to keep in mind. So if you have tintypes in your collection at home, the process of making tintypes is they would, put on the chemicals on the aluminum, and then they would flip it over to make the image. So every single tintype that you have is a reverse. So when you look at these photos, you actually need to go into a software program and use the mirror feature to flip them around. So the man standing would actually be on the left. The woman with her hand on her friend's shoulder would actually be on the right. They're flip-flopped. And that's because of the process of getting the image onto the aluminum. So keep that in mind when you're dealing with these types of images. You want to reverse them in your collection because that could actually help you, because you might have thought, well, this isn't anybody in my family because the part's on the wrong side. Or I knew great grandma had a lazy eye, but that's her left, not her right. So knowing that tintypes are reversed can actually help solve some mysteries for you. But it's a very distinct era. So if you have these in your collection, you know that you can roughly ballpark these to this particular time period. I'm going to show you a couple of other examples. If any of you are lucky enough to have squares or diamonds in your collection, these were ridiculously popular in the mid 1890s. 1895 is kind of your bullet point that you're going a couple of years in either direction. 1895 is where you're starting and you're slowly moving the gauge back and forth. There are a couple of other fads in these two particular photos that set them as dead ringers for 1895. Not only the diamond shape, and thankfully it was short-lived, because how do you display these? How do you put them in an album? How do you hang them, up on your wall? But ladies' fashion, top knots, where they would twist their hair into a knot at the top of their head, top knots were all the rage in the mid 1890s. So both of these ladies, two different communities, not related in any way, both have top knots, which tells me that's the era that I'm dealing with. And then the outfits, the dresses that they're wearing, high frilly collars were all the rage in the 1890s as well. So I can see both ladies. The one on the left looks a little bit more like a circus outfit with the stripes, but they both have high collars, high frilly collars on. And that was also very indicative of that time period. So I can be looking through photos. If I see a diamond, I'm going to start with 1895 and I'm going to move my marker, maybe 1 or 2 years in the opposite direction. But the fact that they both have top knots and high collars, 1895. So I can be fairly confident and certain with that. If any of you have these really long rectangular portraits, they were very, very popular between 1910 and 1925. By 1925, they're pretty much done. You're going to see them during the First World War era, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. They were really, really popular in that time period. And basically, they're 8.5 by 3. So it's like a regular size sheet of paper, or 8 by 3. So they could get more than one and slice them. So you could get more than one image on a page, like bookmarks, so to speak. So they probably got 3 images for every, regular sized sheet that they were working with. But some things that give these away, 2 out of the 3 of them have high schools, the name of the high school embedded in them. So all 3 of these are senior class photos. They're getting their photo taken for their senior year. It's probably going into their class photo, either posters, some of them are large posters, or into a yearbook. But what I love about them is that 2 of them, one says JTS, which would be Joliet Township High School, and it has the year, and then the other one tells me that it's Plainfield and gives me the year. So I might not know who the students are, but I can say without a reasonable doubt that this is Joliet, this is Plainfield, this is 1918. Let's see if I can find a class photo of that year so I can identify this young lady or this young man. So if you're lucky enough that they already have the school embedded in the photo, that's fantastic. But like this young one in the middle, this is Clinton King. He is from the town of Plainfield. He doesn't have that marker in it, but I recognize the photo style and I know the time period. So it wouldn't be much for me to go through 5 or 6 years of class photos or 5 or 6 years of yearbooks looking for this young man in those photos. So this style is perfect because at a glance, I can say, senior class photo, let's go see if I can figure out where. Photo postcards also were extremely popular in the 19-teens. They run from about 1900 up to 1920, but their heyday is really 1905 to 1915. So I'm probably setting my marker at 1910 and I'm working back and forth in a couple directions. If you are lucky enough that it already had been put through the mail, like you can see in the one on the right, I can see that the date stamp tells me that it was 1908, tells me who it was sent to and where it came from. So it arrived in Plainfield and it went to, Mrs. James Chaplin. They did not write their names on it. So I don't know who the sender was, but I can figure it out based on the fact that they wrote their kids' names and ages on the back of it. So I can figure out who Aura and Orrin Burkett are, who sent it based on the fact that the kids' names are on the back of it. This one on the left, this is Lila Canary. She's absolutely adorable. I have dozens of pictures of Lila as a young lady at my local historical society. There's no date associated with this, but there's some features that help me. The fact that it's a postcard, so I know it's roughly between 1900 and 1920. I can look at what she's wearing. So she's wearing a plain white dress with, black leggings and boots. That's very common in the aughts, 1900 to 1910. And then luckily, because her name is on the back of it, I can look and see when Lila's born and when Lila passes away, because she's probably about 18 months to 2 years old in this photo. So if Lila's born in 1906, which she is, I can date this photo to roughly 1908, give or take a little, based on all of that additional information. And if you look at the chair behind her, she's in one of those little, you'll see another one, I believe, one of those little metal, like soda fountain chairs, with the wire, the bent wire. That was very, very popular in that time period. So when you see those types of chairs, I'm instantly going to 1900 to 1910. So that helps in that process. Art Deco revival. Post-war, all the way into the mid-1950s. You do see some during the war years, 41 to 45, but you see a lot of them, 47, 48, 49, this Art Deco revival. So even if, again, you can't necessarily identify the photography studio that might be listed or who the people are in the photos, you can ballpark it to a decade. And there are other things that give this away as well. So in the upper left, he's wearing his military uniform. First thing that I can recognize when I look at it is he's a Marine because he has the eagle and the ball on his hat. So right away, I know that I'm dealing with a photo of a Marine, most likely Second World War or Korea, could potentially be Korea. I can ballpark this. Who do I know that was in that branch of service? Her hairstyle, her tight pin curls, the floral dress that she's wearing with that particular style of collar, very, very popular post-war. And then military styling. And I think I have one more photo of this for you a little later on. Everybody kind of emulates that and brings it into their fashion styles during military engagements. During the Civil War, epaulets and buttons and pins were very popular. During the First World War and Second World War, sailor outfits, pleats were very, very popular in both boys and girls styles. So looking at this little boy in his little sailor outfit with his stripes on his collar tells me that I'm dealing with something around a military engagement, which could be, again, World War I or World War II or Korea. So these are the types of details that you pull out of these images to just ballpark it. Like I said, you might not know yet. It might take months. It might take years before you're able to identify everybody, but you're kind of getting these ideas and you're kind of putting them into categories. Kodaks, Polaroid. had three different, actually you could say four different incarnations throughout their existence. The very first Polaroids were actually hard-sided. They weren't the floppy images that we're all familiar with from the 70s and 80s. They were hard-sided, so they were they would be a hard backing with an image glued to the front of it. The second incarnation, roughly in the late 60s to early 70s, it was a softer, more malleable photo, but still not yet to that big 4x4 square of the floppy image that you would have to shake. We all remember that, I know, that we would have to shake to get the image to finally set. And then the final one in early 70s, 74 to 82, roughly, would be those ones that we're very familiar with. Those 4x4s, you would take your picture and then it would spit it out and you would shake it. Polaroids are back, and they're very, very popular with preteens and tweens right now, where you can go to the store, Michael's or Joann Fabrics, and buy a Polaroid for $70 and they can have at it. So it's kind of having a fourth resurgence, so to speak. But if you have Polaroids, keep in mind that the date that's emblazoned on the image itself is the date that it's developed, not necessarily the date that it's taken. For those first two, you would still have to send these in and get them developed. The miracle of the third, the one we're most familiar with, is that we could do it ourselves. So you'll see lots and lots and lots of these because it was readily accessible. But those first two styles, you still had to take them in and have them developed. So it'll still have a date on it, but that doesn't mean the photo. These are my grandparents' dogs, Christy and her pup Brutus. That doesn't necessarily mean it was taken in September of 67. That's when the photo was developed. And the beauty of early Polaroids is that if an image was damaged, you wouldn't lose the image. So the photo in the middle is of my older sister. You can see that there's damage to the emulsion layer of the print itself, but I didn't lose the image. The one on the far right, this is of me. This is Easter Sunday, 1978. And you can see it's starting to get fissures in the emulsion layer. If that image cracked, if you remember as a kid, you'd cut one open to see what was inside and the image would vanish because you would be losing the gas that's creating the emulsion layer. So once this finally breaks and fissures, that image is going to be lost. So it's important to get those scanned. The other ones are more shelf stable, they'll last, but the 1970s era to 80s era Polaroids are ones you want to deal with as quickly as possible. So they're just kind of some examples of eras and how you can ballpark those. So now let's talk about clothing styles and accessories. These are the things that are going to help me start to identify the time period that I'm dealing with. So if any of you have any of these types of photos in your collections, right? I'm sure several of you who are watching this presentation instantly blurted out, Little Lord Fauntleroy. It's exactly what style this is. And the book Little Lord Fauntleroy was very, very popular at the turn of the 20th century. So I know at a glance that I can ballpark these photos around 1900, a few years before and a few years after. But there's something in the photo on the left that kind of gives it away to earlier than 1900. And it's the tricycle. I'm not going to bore you with a whole long history lesson, but in the 1890s, there was what was called the Good Roads movement, and people were obsessed with bicycles and tricycles, and not like regular bicycles like Wizard of Oz, but tall three-wheeled tricycles. So you would see grown men riding these 6-foot-high tricycles around town. It was a huge thing. But the Good Roads movement is eventually what led to the establishment of the Lincoln Highway, because they wanted to have roads where they could ride their bicycles and not hurt themselves, not hit a rock, not get stuck in the mud, not, fall over. So when you see images in your family where they're proudly standing with a bicycle or a tricycle, I'm starting with the 1890s and I'm moving forward from there. So in this particular photo, the tricycle, coupled with his Little Lord Fauntleroy with the wide frilly collar and the open jacket, tells me between 1895 and 1900. The little boy on the left, look at those curls. Oh my goodness, I can't imagine how they got him to sit long enough to put all those curls in his hair. But again, the very frilly collar. He's got the knickers on, the knee-high pants, the chair. I'm going to look at the detailing of the harp style backing of the chair and see if I can date that or find that same chair in other photos in my collection. But something to know when you're dealing with children's clothing, it's very, very common for boys to be mistaken as girls because they're wearing dresses. And I'm going to show you an example of this in just a second, but boys would wear dresses until they're potty trained. Once they're potty trained, because think about it, you're going to have to constantly be changing diapers and things like that. Once they're potty trained, they moved into the short pants. They moved into knickers. And from the time that they're 3, depending on how long it takes them, from the time that they're about 3 or 3.5 until they reach puberty, until they're about 12, they're going to be wearing these short pants until they're old enough that they're graduating to long pants. That usually, depending on your religion, would correspond to either confirmation or bar mitzvah. But that I'm moving into adulthood now, I'll wear long pants. So when you see these are certain cues for you that I'm dealing with somebody between 3 and 11 or 3 and 12. Oh, he must be older than 12 because now he's graduated to longer pants. Some other types of things you're going to be looking for, like I said, we can recognize Civil War era styles. This is actually the 1870s with a really high, large, oh my goodness, it just drew a blank. It's not a buckle on the back of her dress, the bustle, that's it. The bustle on the back of her dress. She still has a fitted jacket, but the pleats in her dress and the stylized studio portrait background tell me that this is after the Civil War, that we're pushing into the 1870s by this point. The chair that she's leaning against is very particular of a very specific style and point in time, 1870 to 1885, roughly. I'll show you some more examples of this chair in a little bit. But then the photo on the left, right, 1920s, short bobbed hair, very simple dresses, the boys in their caps, their newsboy caps. I can see that this is probably fall or spring because they're wearing jackets and heavy jackets and hats, gloves, scarves. This is just a snippet of a much larger class photo, but you can kind of get a feel based on the girls' hairstyles, based on the hats and the jackets that they're wearing, that you're dealing with a photo taken in the 20s or 30s. So you're looking for those eras are what you're trying to identify. Accessories are a big key in all of this. I absolutely love this tricorn Napoleon style hat that the young lady is wearing in the photo on the left. They're both wearing what are called riding coats or driving coats. So we're dealing with the automobile era at this point. They've got their driving gloves. They've got their driving jackets on. They're dressed to the nines. You're hoping that this is winter because, boy, I'd be melting if I were in a studio in the summer wearing all of that gear. But things you're looking for. The one young lady on the right still has a bow in her hair, which tells me she's unmarried. Because once you're married, you're no longer considered a young lady or a girl. You're not going to wear bows. Her sister's not wearing a bow in her hair. So then who do I know where one sister might be married? The other one might not be. I'm looking at their fingers. Are they wearing wedding rings? What other types of features? The hat. The hat is what helped me narrow this photo down to be between 1914 and 1916, because that was a very style pre-First World War that was popular, hearkening back to the anniversary of the War of 1812 and Napoleon Bonaparte and the whole bit. So I can date this based on, I'm going to show you some examples of ways to identify that looking at old directories, looking at old catalogs and newspaper articles to find out what was the popular style. And that's where I could start to identify these hats and how high they ride. They sit right on the top of their heads. By 1917, they're sitting at the brow. So hats have dropped down 3 or 4 inches, and now they're resting right above the ears, right on the brow line. This young lady in the image on the right, if you look at the pin she's wearing, she has a mourning pin on. It's a photo of a young man. So maybe her fiance or her husband who had passed away, she is in mourning and she is wearing that piece of jewelry in honor of him. For it could be a set period of time, it could be a year, it could be 3 years, it would depend on the time period that the mourning jewelry dates to, and the protocols that surrounded it. But you can see she's kind of looking off pensively into the distance, maybe thinking about her love in this photo. Some more mourning jewelry that you're going to see. So on the little boys' jackets, they have a picture of a baby who probably did not survive, who might have passed away. There's another identifying feature in this photo I want you to keep in mind also. And no, it's not the top knot that the mom is wearing, although that tells me 1895. I'm going to start there as my marker. She's wearing a mourning dress because in Victorian era customs, you wore crepe. You wore that type of fabric to show that you were in mourning for X period of time. And there is no doubt based on how crepe lays and how it sits that that's what she's wearing. She's wearing crepe. So she is in mourning, probably for her child who passed away. And the two young boys are wearing mourning jewelry also on behalf of that child. The girls are wearing white, as you can see. You can see Grandma has her glasses pinned to her jacket, so she always has them handy. So there's lots of details that you can pull out of this particular image. So now some other styles, some other time periods. Like I said, young ladies would wear bows until they were married, and then they would no longer have bows in their hair. So the young lady in the photo on the left is unmarried. So then how do we figure out what is her event? She's holding a bouquet of flowers. She has a white dress on. She has white boots on. Her hair, again, is up in a bow, a white bow. This is, in fact, an 8th grade graduation portrait. If she were getting confirmed or having her confirmation or some other event, she would probably have like a Bible or a rosary in her hand or some other type of religious symbol. She's holding flowers here. So based on the fact that she's wearing a white dress, which most graduating classes, the women would wear white, I can narrow it down to within a couple of events. She's not getting married because there's no partner. Yes, she could be standing up in a wedding, but based on her age and some of the other features, it's most likely 8th grade graduation, which was confirmed by the family. Here's my grandma and grandpa. I talked about my grandma Jean and my grandpa Casey. It's a photo of my grandpa taking a picture of somebody taking a picture of him, but definitely 1940s. Her open-toed shoes, she's wearing white shoes. You could see the background, all of the trees are fully leafed out, so we're dealing with summer or early fall. The cravat that he's wearing, you could see my grandfather is holding the camera. You could see his wedding ring. So this tells me that it's after June of 1941 because he has his wedding ring on. So I'm looking for those types of details. And I talked about how do you tell if you're dealing with a young boy or a young girl, because boys would wear dresses up until the time they were potty trained. A couple of things that give this photo away. The pleating. Young boys would typically wear plaids or pleats or other military stylistic outfits. So we could see it's very much a military style of dress. It has a belt. Most young ladies wouldn't have belts, but the boys would. The pleats on it tell me. But then look at the girls. They're all wearing black tights and the boy is wearing white tights. So you're looking for key features. There's that chair again that he's standing on, where that type of soda fountain type wire chair, very, very popular in the aughts at the turn of the 20th century. So I can kind of date that to that time period. I'm looking at the jewelry that the young girls are wearing to see if anything's identifiable, to kind of get an idea for who or where it might have been taken. Those are the types of things you're pulling out. So let's talk about professions for a second. Sometimes it's obvious. You've got a bartender, you've got a nurse, you've got a railroad conductor in their outfits that make it clear. The young lady on the left is a nurse. If you look really closely, you could see her glasses, her rimless glasses that are resting on her nose. In the upper right-hand corner, you have railroad conductor who's standing on his vehicle. So you can see him in his uniform with his hat. Luckily, I have a picture of him with his interurban train car. So I have the name and the number of the car above the first window. But then sometimes it's not quite so obvious. So this one in the bottom corner, you've got C.C. Heron. You could see it's C.C. Heron Home Baking and Baked Beans. That's quite a combination. If you look at the photo, I can see that it's winter. I can see the snow on the ground to the left of the building. They have the door wide open. I can hear my grandma Nellie yelling, "Shut the door, you're letting all the heat out." But boy or girl? Can't quite tell. It's a girl, actually. You can see there's no belt, there's no pleating. You can see she's wearing black tights. That's actually their daughter. But one other thing tells me that this photo is taken at Christmas, and it's the garland hanging in the window. Historically, you would not decorate your Christmas tree until Christmas Eve or Christmas Day. So the simple fact that they have Christmas decorations in their window tells me that it's within a couple of days of that particular event. So I can see that the address is 236. I don't know where this is taken. All of the years of research I've done, I still can't narrow this down to a specific location. But I do know enough about the Heron family to put it in the Chicagoland area within 1 or 2 cities, but I can't be sure where. There's no city directories for those years. But we're dealing with between roughly 1910 and 1914 on this particular photo. Other occupations, Lockwood Dairy in the upper corner. You know, on his jacket, it has the name of the company. So, you know, you can't zoom in on it, but you would see that it says Lockwood. So I would know that that's the dairy involved. The bottom photo, painting and wallpapering. You know, there's all of his equipment. But look at the type of vehicle. Look at how the trees are leafless. Look at how it's a dirt road. All of those things are putting it in an era and a time period for me. So we know it's after 1908 because that's when vehicles are established and readily available. So you're looking at those types of details in your photos. These are 2 of my favorites. Bottom right-hand corner, we have Art Nickel, who's a bartender. You know, so you have him at work mixing drinks. The photo, the larger photo up above him, this is actually taken in Lincoln, Nebraska. This is Hollis Craig's grocery store. I absolutely love this. I scanned it at a super high resolution so I can see all of the details, the names of the cans on the shelves, you know, the fact that he's got onions and beets in the bin in the foreground, that you could see, you know, the cans and the coffee cans be in the background behind them over their shoulders, the tin ceilings, work uniform, quote unquote, white shirts, bow ties, aprons. I don't have a specific date for this one, but I know it's right around roughly 1920, 1925. I suppose if the lamp wasn't in the way of the clock, I might have been able to tell what time it was. But these photos are great. If you're lucky enough to have interior shots of people at work, they really give you a snapshot into what were they selling, what was popular, what was on the shelf. Eddie Gardner was a famous race car driver. He decided that that was not exciting enough for him, so he decided he was going to get into aerial stunt piloting. So right about the time of the First World War, he learns how to fly planes. He's down in Texas, working at Kelly Field in Texas, training U.S. Army pilots how to fly planes. After the war ends, he goes into the stunt piloting, doing barnstorming tours and things like that in and around the Midwest. He dies in a plane crash in 1922. But here's a picture of him in his race car in the 19-teens. You can see the steering wheel is on the left, not on the right. I can tell that it's fall because the leaves are still on the trees, but they're all in heavy coats and jackets because it's cold outside. So the leaves haven't dropped yet, but the temperature has. Look at the pneumatic tires. These are fascinating to me. Just the size of the tires compared to the vehicle. And then his airplane. And he had taken the time to write all of the different parts of his plane onto the photo itself. This was actually he was a U.S. airmail pilot during the war. So these are the pictures of him. Here's where the mail went. Here's where I sat. Here's where his partner, Lou Tower, sat. And it gives a description of the plane, but he's got his leather jacket on. He's got his leather boots on, ready for takeoff. So let's talk about military photos for just a second. Sometimes it's easy to identify. You look at this photo and your brain should instantly say that's First World War because I recognize the doughboy style of hat. They're also wearing trench coats, which were established during the First World War for the units that were literally in the trenches at the time. It's winter. There's no leaves on the trees. There's no green grass. And apparently they had plenty of downtime at Camp Dodge that they were screwing around And this guy's walking away like, oh, I'm not getting caught. I'm not getting caught, not doing my job. But you can identify the time period and the style based on their uniforms. Sometimes it's not so easy. So the one on the left is definitely Civil War era. You could see that he's a Union soldier because he's wearing the dark jacket versus the light colored gray for Confederate. The style of the photograph is very simple. There's no background to it. And another feature gives this away to that era, and it's the simple stripes of the frame of the cardboard that the image is glued to. So original photos taken in the 1850s would have no markings. In the 1860s, you'll start to see one stripe and then two stripes to identify those photos. These are small. They're like 2.5 by 3.5 cabinet cards, smaller cabinet cards. So I'm looking at the stripes around the photo. I'm looking at the style of clothing, the buttons in the jacket he's wearing to identify this as Civil War era. The one on the right, he's a cadet. He's in his dress uniform. He has his hat on. He has his gloves, his white gloves on. He has his saber by his side. This is actually Spanish-American War. This is Andrew Burkett, who actually wound up being killed in action in 1903. But this is him as a cadet at the academy getting ready for graduation. Remember what I said about tintypes being a reverse process? So you can see in this particular photo on the left, this is the Korean War. They had done one of those photo booths where you received the 3 photos for your nickel. And this was done overseas in Korea. And it was that same process as a tintype. So when it printed the image on the paper, it's reversed. So I can guarantee you they weren't wearing their hats backwards. This is just an example of a 20th century example of that process, that reverse process. So I would go into my software program and mirror this so that it flips it around to the correct way. The photo on the right, Second World War, some identifying features that I'm looking for. He has his wings on, so I know that somehow he is dealing with airplanes and either Army Air Corps or Navy, but I can look at his jacket and I can look at the stripes on his jacket. I can look at the badge, the unit identifier, the circle badge on his uniform to know that, that it was not the Navy, that it was Army Air Corps. And then on his lapel, he has his bombardier pins. So I know that he was a bombardier in the Second World War without ever having to ask anybody, just simply by looking at the uniform that John's wearing. This is Elmer. You're going to see Elmer a little later on. Elmer served in both the Second and the First World War. So on the right, I'm looking at him in his World War II lieutenant's uniform. You could tell officers from enlisted men because the band on their hat is different. So you definitely want to keep that in mind when you're looking at uniforms. I can see the lapel pins that he's wearing. The 2 flags crossed. That tells me that he was in the Signal Corps. So I'm looking at that. I'm looking at the ribbon that he's wearing on his jacket to identify the location. Is he stateside? Is he European theater? Is he Pacific theater? That band would be different. That ribbon would be different. His World War I uniform, it's not a great image. You can't see it very well, but he has a symbol on his jacket that is a little washed out in this photo. But also Signal Corps. He was in the Signal Corps in the First World War as well. If you zoomed in on the pins on his collar, they would say US, so I would know that he was US military, not foreign. And then you're looking at just his uniform in general for additional details. So you're pulling out those little bits and pieces to tell a story. So let's talk briefly about props and backgrounds. So sometimes you're going to use these to help ballpark eras. Like I said, in the 1850s and 1860s, you're standing against a bare wall or just a plain colored sheet. There's no ornamentation at all. A lot of early photos, it's a headshot like what we saw with that photo of the soldier, James Burnett, or somebody's seated or 2 people are standing. There's no tables, there's no ornamentation. After the war, when you start to move into the 1870s and 80s, you start to get a lot of ornate backgrounds. So from 1866, you'll start to see some scenery in the background. You'll start to see windows and doors and things like that, like fancy backgrounds. The one on the right, you see what looks like a castle with an ornate window in the background. It's just a backdrop. And then he's being propped up by holding the chair next to him. 1870s, very elaborate backgrounds. You can see that he's standing in front of one of those as well. Again, you can see that we're dealing with a boy, again, potty trained, probably about 8 years old, wearing his suit with his knickerbocker pants. This is actually a little boy, even though it's a little bit more frilly than normal. I think it's because he had 2 older sisters and he was the first son. And it could be, it's too old to be christening because the gown is too short. But it's definitely a young lady's outfit. Here he is again, this time with another sibling. You could see that same ornate background in the background with the fancy castle-like window and the chair. You're looking at these chairs, you're looking at these props so that you, even if there's no photographer's mark, these are taken probably at the same studio or about the same time because they're using the same props and backgrounds. So we have the same background between these. We have the same chair between these photos. They're roughly about the same age. Again, you've got the short pants. You've got the Lord Fauntleroy, big fluffy collars, wide collars. So we're ballparking this to about 1900, give or take a little. Here's that ubiquitous chair. Every one of these photos is taken at a different time. On the top left, this photo is taken about 1864, 1866, 1864, 1872, and roughly about 1870. You'll see this chair all the way up into the 1880s, but the chair, every photography studio had this chair. So we have Plainfield, Illinois, Aurora, Illinois, Scotland, Iowa, and the Chicagoland. I don't remember specifically the one, but different states, different countries. This is the chair that is most popular. So you're going to see this a lot. And if you see this chair, I'm definitely ballparking it 1865 to 1885. That is a huge window. Yes, absolutely it is. But again, you can break it down further from there based on who's in the photo. So the young lady in the bottom left-hand corner, see how her dress is very militaristic, stars, epaulets, braiding, very, very popular. This is post-Civil War, roughly about 1872. I think it's a wedding photo because she gets married in 1872. If you could look closely enough, you see that she had her ears pierced. So that sets her apart from some other siblings based on the pierced ears. Again, the chair, I'm looking at other features in that. Here's another example. I showed you this style chair earlier. Little boy has that chair. Older sibling has that chair. Well, we don't see it in the photo of the woman on the right, but we see it in the photo below and the one next to it. But how do we tie them together? The tablecloth for the above photo is in the tablecloth for the man at the bottom. It's the same tablecloth that's resting across the chair in the upper left, as well as the tablecloth that's on the photo in the center. So taken at the same time, probably all at the same studio. The 4 are tintypes. The one in the bottom right is a carte de visite, one of those large 5x7s. The 4 tintypes, they're all related, and yes, they were probably all taken at the same time. The bottom one is taken probably by the same photography studio because she lived in that place, but she's not a member of the family. It's just another photo from that studio. Luckily, hers has the name of the studio on it. The other ones do not. So you slowly start to look for these features to be able to tie them together, to be able to say, yes, they're probably all a family group because I see these same things across the board. So let's talk about photographer's marks for a minute. If you're lucky enough that it's on the photo itself, either on the back or on the front, you could begin to look that up to see how and when that photography studio was in business and what locations. Studios move, and I'm going to show you an example of that in just a second. But we can see we've got I.B. Stanton, who's at the corner of Main and Market Streets in Amsterdam, New York. We've got Hughes in the Young Building in Joliet. We have Giles, who's new ground floor studio. So this is a move. This is a change in location. Now at the corner of LaSalle and Benton Streets in Aurora. So I'm going to look for when did Giles move to this location, because obviously they're advertising that they're in a new place. So it's going to be relatively close to the actual move date. What about when you have a photographer who's been in business for over 50 years? You look at the evolution of the photographer's mark. Remember what I said about the diamonds, 1895. That's what I'm starting with. But then I have a tax stamp, 1865. So I've got a 40-year window in which to try to put the rest of these photos into order. I'm looking at how elaborate is the photographer's mark. You can see that they progressively get more and more elaborate as technology improves and becomes more and more elaborate. I'm looking at the addresses. Some just say Broadway, some say 48 Broadway. So we're looking at the change in those features. But look at how the name changes. DC Pratt, DC Pratt, DC Pratt. But then by the time we get to 1865, what do we see? It's not DC Pratt anymore. It's now Pratt's New Photography Gallery. So either DC Pratt dies or one of his family members or somebody buys the photography studio and keeps the name, but scrubs DC from the title. But look at what it says. New Photography Gallery, corner of LaSalle and Benton Streets in Aurora. So if I go back one, what happened? Does Giles take over Pratt or does Pratt take over Giles? In fact, Giles winds up taking over Pratt Studio. So Giles merges, takes over Pratt Studio, and now his new location becomes the corner of LaSalle and Benton Streets. So how do we find those? We're looking at things like I mentioned, school records and yearbooks. So if I've got a photo that looks like a senior class photo, how do I go back and recreate that? We're looking at catalogs and advertising. I'm going to show you an example of one of those in just a second. We're looking at city directories for when the photographer was in business at that time. Who do I know that lived in Milwaukee? Who do I know that lived in Des Moines? And I'm putting that information into my family tree. Oh, Aunt Judy's family lived in Des Moines, potentially at this time period when this photographer's mark was taken. I'm looking at newspapers because newspapers are going to list at the photography studio, or it's going to list the family in that area, maybe getting their photo taken at the studio. School records are another one that I can rely on if you're lucky enough to find them. So I had this photo that was in the church's collection at Wheatland Presbyterian Church in the church scrapbooks. On the back of it, it had the name of the teacher, and it had 5 students named, including the little girl in the white apron. She was just listed as Marge Rance. I know who Marge Rance is. That's wonderful. What gives this photo away is the fact that there are lilacs on the windowsill. Lilacs only grow at a very specific time of year. So I know this isn't fall. I know this isn't summer because lilacs are no longer in bloom in that time period. So I was lucky enough that the school records existed for the school for 1865, not at the church, but in a different location. And I was able to identify that photo within 4 days of when it was taken, because there were only 4 or 5 days that every single child was in class in that spring semester of 1895. So the X's are the dates when the photo could have possibly have been taken between April and May of 1895. And not only was I lucky enough that some of the students and the teacher were named on the back, but the school roster had all 14 children. So with fairly decent accuracy, I can pick out who all of the kids are based on their sex and their age that's listed in the daily teacher register. So sometimes you just got to pull sources from other locations. Like, I'm not exactly sure who this little boy is. This is a photo that was donated to my library with no information on it. But I know that it's taken at the Savoy Photography Studio in Joliet, so I can find the dates for that studio. But then I also find the table listed in a furniture catalog from that era as well. So you know that the photo's not going to be taken before 1893, if that's the first year that you find that style of table being advertised and sold. So we know it's after 1893 because that's the first instance of that particular chair being made available for sale. So you're looking for those types of things to help you as well. Like I said, you're looking for photographers' information in city directories and in newspapers. I have a photo of Loretta Burnett. I think it's taken about 1890, 1880, 879, not 100% sure. The closest city directory for that time period is 1873. It's at a different address. So what could have happened? The photography studio could have moved. So Charles Murr could have moved before or after, and this is either the new or the old address. Or the city could have renumbered. So always check to make sure that the city didn't rename or renumber streets, because he could have still been at 39, but the city renumbered. Or there could have been some other instance that might have happened. So in this article, which dates to September 26th of 1879, tells me that a fire breaks out in Murr's studio and his entire collection is destroyed, that his gallery is insured for $10,000 and it should cover the cost. So my guess is 39 is the new address because a fire destroyed the studio in September of 1879. Newspapers are great for other things too. Like here's an example of Miss Martha Steffens, who was in business for years, who sells her business and moves out of state. And it's information about her and her business and what happened to her. So sometimes you'll find some great stuff that comes out of the local newspaper about studios and photographers. City directories are a great place. You can find them on Fold3. You can find them on Internet Archive. You can find them on Google Books. You are all absolutely blessed of the fact that Appleton City directories are available through the library's website. So you can do some of this research. If you're researching in and around Appleton, just go to the library's website. You have access to the Appleton Memory Project to help you in your research. But they're readily available online. You should be able to do a search for different communities. Other places where you can go to look in your handout, you have these links so you don't have to copy them. Langdon Road is a great one because if it's not listed, you can provide the information to her and she will do a little bit more research to see what she can find about that studio and get it added to her list, her inventory. Great resource for you as well. So let's talk about age progressions for just a second. Ooh, I went too fast, sorry. We're going to talk about age regressions and age progressions, and then we'll be done and I'll be able to send you on your way. Here's Elmer. I absolutely adored Elmer. Elmer and I were like peas and carrots. We were very, very close. I had met him when I was working on the Veterans Oral History Project, and he was one of my interviewees that I interviewed about his experience during the Second World War. So he provided us with photos and details of his life on a destroyer, as well as sat for a photograph before we took his interview. And you could look at, you see the mischievousness just pour out of every part of his body. He was so silly and mischievous. He was wonderful. But certain features that you can bring forward, your nose, your ears, they grow your whole life. That doesn't change, that changes, but what doesn't change? You know, the distance of your eyes apart, you know, the shape of your jaw. If you have indent in your chin or dimples, that never changes. That never goes away. If one eye is higher than the other, if you have what I call a carrot in your eyebrow, where you have a raised portion to your eyebrow, that always stays the same. So you can just look at features and find them from photo to photo. Like if you look at him as a young man, he has those lines, those smile lines next to his mouth, absolutely still has those same smile lines as an older gentleman in the photo on the right. So you're looking for those types of details. This is Janet. Janet was 4'6" if she was an inch. She was a very tiny lady. So the chair almost feels out of proportion based on what I know about her height. We're looking at a photo right about the Civil War on the left. We're looking at her with her son and her daughter in the photo in the center. And then, believe it or not, a photo of her and her grandson in the photo on the right. Her grandson is a spitting image for her son. They look identical. And if she hadn't aged in that photo, I would have easily have thought that it was a photo of her and her son. But this is actually her grandson. So, but some things never changed. She loved wearing her hair back in a knot. You can see the lines next to her nose. She has a very thin lip. She has a very strong, broad jaw. Stays the same from photo to photo. You're looking for those types of details. These are her siblings. So across the top, we have her younger brother, Alex, and across the bottom, we have her sister, Marion. Alex has a colic, and it shows up in almost every photo of him from a child all the way up to an old man. One little piece of hair that sticks up, and you see it in the infant photo. You see it in the photo in the center. You kind of see it sticking up right above his ear on the right-hand side in the Civil War era photo. Janet had the most piercing eyes I've ever seen, or not Janet, her sister Marion, most piercing eyes I've ever seen in any photo. So I can find Marion from photo to photo because I'm looking for those eyes. And you can see as she gets older, you know, she has what I call hooded eyes, where her eyebrows, it kind of shadows. And you see that in the bottom photos, makes it easier to identify her from photo to photo. In the very last photo, by that point, she's blind. And she still has that piercing look about her that helps me identify her from photo to photo. But she loved wearing her hair up as well. And as an older lady, I can spot her based on those photos. But you can see the scar on her neck too. That also helps me identify her in some photos as well. Back to that school, I was talking about Wheatland Presbyterian School. The school across the street was called Tamarack School. And you could see the 3 children in the background. Look at this photo. Half of them aren't even wearing shoes. One of them's holding a baseball bat. You can see the girls with their bows in their hair. But if you look at the 3 I have circled, they're easy to spot. So I showed you Elmer's World War I and World War II photos already. Elmer's the one on the right. You can see his ears, his eyebrows. He has that carrot where it kind of tucks up in the center. Clinton King, we saw his high school senior photo earlier. Here's Clinton. My grandmother would say, looks like he's got the cab with the car doors open. Definitely has ears that you can see trailing. Again, the shape of his mouth. He has, you know, a fuller bottom lip. See, that continues. And then Janet. Janet just had a very specific way of smirking and tipping her head. So I can spot Janet in photos throughout the course of her life because of how she purses her lips and tilts her head. And I can easily pull her out of photos based on that one detail alone, because we all have mannerisms that we bring with us throughout our lives. And those are certain things that I look for in photographs as well. So now, what about working backwards? What about if you have photos of somebody as a senior and you're trying to work back? So here's an example. This is Allie and her husband, Tom. This is Allie on the right before she gets married. This is Allie on her wedding day. And then Allie after her firstborn. Right after her firstborn in his christening gown. So you can see she really likes that hard split, that part down the middle. You can see how her hair curls up on the sides. She really likes frilly high collars. I came across an album. It was listed as unidentified online through Fulton History, Fulton Postcards. And I'm flipping through this photo album and I come across a series of pictures and I was like, wow, I know those faces. And I came across one and I was like, oh my goodness, that's Allie. I'm certain that's Allie. So here's the photo. Again, very tight split in the middle, hair curled up on the ends. She's a young lady, so her face is a little bit pudgier, but still has that kind of high collar. Ears are very similar. Don't know who the gentleman is in the photo on the left, but I think it's a family member of some kind. And I thought, I'm imagining things. There's no way that this is the same family. The album I just showed you is from about 15 years later than this album. This album predates the Civil War to write about the Civil War. The album I have goes from about 1870 to about 1880. But as I'm flipping through, there's no doubt in my head that I'm dealing with the same family. So I reached out to the owner and I said, well, can I buy the album? And he says, no, unfortunately, I've already sold it. He says, but I do have scans. He says, what makes you think that it's the same family? 37 photo comparisons that I gave him. Here's what I have. And he said, you know what? I think you're absolutely right. I think it is the same family. So these are photos I had, again, 10 to 15 years later. This one I flipped because the other one in the album is a tintype, so I had to reverse it. She really loved her bows. I have lots of photos of her, you know, with her big tied bows, but you could see again, the hair, very simple, very serene, how her eyes are partly hooded and it casts a shadow over her brow. I have no doubt that these are her parents, only 15 years younger. Same thing with her in-laws. This is Thomas and Elizabeth Burnett, Thomas's father and mother. I have no doubt that in the other album are Thomas's parents, just a little bit younger. He has a very distinct under beard that's not over his chin, just right underneath his chin, which is very similar that he kept throughout his entire life of the photos I have of him. See how his hair is a little bit puffy and a little unruly? It's very much like that as a young man as well, but I'm certain that these are Thomas's parents as young people as well. So sometimes you just have to work backwards. Sometimes you don't have any control over that. But then sometimes you look at a photo and you're like, God, that looks just like my brother Bob. And that's when you say, this is obviously got to be somebody in the family because of the family resemblances. So here's a picture of me and my grandpa Casey. We are the only two that had dimples. Nobody else in my family has dimples, just the two of us. Here's one of those diamond photographs. This is Yoretta and her mother, taken in 1871. I have no doubt that she is her mother's child because they look almost identical. And then I talked about Marion already. This is Marion's granddaughter, Marion, who when I first met Marion in person, I actually gasped out loud at how much she looked like her grandmother. And she chuckled and she said, I get that a lot. So anytime you're flipping through photos and you're like, oh, that looks just like so-and-so, make a note of it. Make a mental note because it's probably somebody from that side of the family. And you can use that as a clue to help identify these going forward. So in your handout, you already have the websites. Like I said, Appleton Memory Project, absolutely outstanding. You already have access to not only the photos, but you have access to city directories and the like. Take full advantage of that. You have the others in your handout already. You don't need to copy those down. Books. There are lots and lots of books out there to help you either identify by era or identify by photo style or identify by what they're wearing, the clothing styles and the props that are being used. There are lots of resources out there for you to take advantage of as well. So use books. You're logged onto the library to learn about this process today. Go to your local library if it's not Appleton and check some of these books out or request them through interlibrary loan because they're going to help you identify those eras and those styles. This would be an awkward family photo, wouldn't it? That's one of my favorite websites. If you go to awkward family photos, it's all people of a certain age who are posting 70s and 80s photos of like really terrible plaid outfits with paisley shirts. And so it's a lot of fun, but there's lots of places out there to not only share your family photos and history, but learn how to identify them as well. So I'm going to turn my camera back on. I am going to probably stop sharing my screen and then hopefully answer some questions.
Yes, first, a big round of applause. Wow, I've learned so much, so many great photos you shared and great examples, lots of great information. I think we all just want to go look at every historic photo we have just to like pick out all the details now because we have so much information. But thank you so much. We got a couple of really great questions as well. So somebody asked, are the eras and types of photos that you talked about just for American photos, or would they apply to other countries as well?
They would apply to other countries, absolutely. But you also have to keep in mind cultural significances as well. So I'll give you an example. Eastern Europe, Czech, Slovak, Polish, Hungarian. It was custom if somebody passed away for women to wear white, not black. So sometimes you have to know what you're dealing with. Because I had one photo and I actually got into a disagreement with somebody over it because they were like, oh, it must be a wedding photo. I was like, oh, no. That's a mourning photo. And they said, well, how do you know? And I said, is your family Czech? And they said, yeah, why? And I said, here's why. Because this was the custom. This is the style of dress that one of them is wearing. This is the time period that would have been most popular. So the same types of features. Mourning customs in the UK were way stronger and more pronounced than they were in the US. So you'll find a lot more mourning jewelry and like crepe and things like that in the Victorian era, 1840 to 1903, 1901. I'm going to get that wrong. 1901. Then here in the States, we were a little later to come into that. So for us, it's like late 1840s, 1850s, not 1843 when Prince Albert dies. But the styles of photography are going to be generally the same. It might hit in one area a year or two before, but the general timeframes are still going to be the same. Carte de visites were very, very popular in Europe, and you're going to find lots of them during that time period. So it's just a matter of kind of ballparking it to within a year or two, and then looking in that culture and in that area to find out when did this start there.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Someone was asking about those three rectangular school portraits that you showed. They said the edges shown are also slightly different. Does that mean that they were different studios?
Two of them are, two of them the same, one of them is a different studio. It just depends on how they fit into the frame. So somebody might have clipped the edges to get it to fit into the frame, and somebody might not have. So it just depends on the studio, but definitely use that as an example to say, how did they do this? What was their process? Did they glue it? Did they clip it? Did they put it in brackets? Like, what was their process of creating the image? Because it's not uncommon for some studios to round their edges. And then, some didn't, so they could tuck into those photo albums that already had the pre-cut slots in them, so you could slide them in. If you curve the edges, you can't slide them in. But you would curve the edges if you were putting them into, my mind just went blank. If you were putting them into like the glued in photo corners. So if you're putting them in a photo corner, you're probably going around the edge because it's easier to get it in and out than a tight corner. Whereas if it's a pre-cut frame, you're going to slide them in, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
so there would
absolutely
be reasons behind why they would do it.
Makes sense. Someone kind of has a question kind of based on your age progression ones. They're wondering if there's any facial recognition technology that can tell if it's the same person or not.
There is. It creeps me out. But Google Picasa originally was kind of the first group that was using this type of facial recognition. A lot of different softwares use it now. Facebook even tries to do it. If you try to upload a photo, it tries to go. My iPhone does the same thing. It says, "Is this you and your brother?" So there's software out there, but you have to give it a large enough basis in which to detect it. So if you have a bunch of photos, the onus is kind of on you to go in and already tag and identify so that the software can work, because you can't expect it to find somebody if you've only given it one example. So for example, if I go in and I name 15 photos and identify everybody in those 15 photos, it gives it a better basis to work from to say, oh, is this Ann? Is this Tom? Than if I don't name any of my photos. Because believe it or not, it utilizes all of that data to kind of build a profile for you. But here's where it gets funny. My dad lost a $20 bet to my mother because he was convinced that a photo was my sister when it was me. So when you have siblings that look so close that it's hard to identify, facial recognition can't always pick up those subtleties. Because I'm one of 5 kids, and with the exception of my younger brother, the 4 older kids all look identical. So it's more of a challenge. But that's where you're giving it information and you're naming your photos so that it can do that work for you. But that's where you look for the subtle details. Does one have pierced ears and not the other one? Does one wear glasses and the other one doesn't? Does one have freckles and the other one doesn't? You're looking for those, and only the human eye can really pick that out. Facial recognition isn't looking for pierced ears. It's not looking for wedding rings. You have to do that.
Yeah. Very helpful. And if you're like me, when you don't look anything like your siblings and your siblings tell you growing up that you're adopted because my brother and sister look alike and I don't look like them or anybody else in the family, future generations are going to have fun with that unless I identify my photos.
That's common though. We had my middle sister convinced she was adopted too, even though my parents couldn't tell us apart. So, it's sibling teasing.
Yes,
I guess take
course.
it for what it's worth.
Someone said they are wondering if you have any suggestions on where you would find more information on things that you find in a photo. Like, for example, they can see a license plate from Minnesota in a photo. Like, how would they go about finding more information to see if they can help date or identify that photo?
I would either reach out to the Minnesota Historical Society or the state archives. And luckily, they're in the same place, so it makes it pretty easy. So like in Illinois, the state of Illinois Secretary of State has these printed published books that they used to put out every year of all of the license plate owners. So if I have a plate from 1932, I can go to this resource and put in the plate because it has the owner and the plate number and see, because if you zoom in, a lot of them will have the year because it'll tell you this is a sticker for 1912 or 1919. So reach out to the state, either to the Secretary of State's, whoever the driver's license facilities are, but definitely the state. Minnesota's Historical Society is absolutely amazing. Yes. I have family from Moorhead and St. Paul, so I've used their resources on more than one occasion. That same Middleton family was all over the place. They were in Wisconsin and in Minnesota and in Iowa, but they might have a printed published work already that has that listed.
Perfect. Someone's wondering how you can tell if a photo is a tintype or not.
The material. I mean, if you're looking at a digitized scan, it'll be the glare. You'll get a slight glare that comes off of it. But I mean, if you've got a stack of photos, absolutely, because it's made out of aluminum. And that's the only type that was ever done that way. So if you have one in your hand, you know right away by the feel and the color of it. If you're looking at a scan online, it's a little harder, but they're usually darker backgrounds. There's usually a little bit of a shine because there are processes to raise it up off the glass so you don't get what are called Newtonian rings, which leaves like little spirals. If somebody just lays it, or like a daguerreotype, a glass plate, just straight down on the glass, you're going to get those little circles in it. So that's kind of a way to tell that you're dealing with a certain type of material. But like I said, you know, you could be on family vacation and go and get a tintype made next week.
Yeah.
So my family's going to be like, what? Why?
All these trends that are, you know, taking things from many years past are going to be very confusing to the future generations.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another tintype related question is, what if the tintype is very dark? Can you clean it somehow?
Yes, I wouldn't recommend doing it. I mean, you absolutely can. So the process of making a tintype was they would typically be varnished. So you would have your image, and in order to keep it scratch resistant, they would typically put varnish on it. Varnish yellows over time, and it causes it to darken. That is perfectly, it's the same thing with wood. The exact same process happens. I wouldn't recommend using any type of toner or cleaner to take the varnish off because that leaves the image exposed and potential damage. But what I'd probably do is I would scan it and I would lighten it up on a photo software. I would not mess with the original, or you can reach out to a conservator. So there are several conservation companies that could probably help, whether it's Chicago Conservation Center, Northeast Document Conservation Center. There are places out there if you wanted to spend the money to have a professional do it. Don't do it yourself. Just make a scan and play with the contrast and the brightness on the scan.
Yeah, good suggestion. Our next question, who sold the chairs and backdrops to the studios?
Companies. And you'll find those in city directories. You'll find prop companies. You'll find like paper hangers and wallpaperers. Very, very common for them to be supplying the backdrops for photography studios. So just take a look at the city directory. So think of it like cemeteries. You've got to have a hearse get you there. You've got to have a headstone carved. You've got to have an undertaker, you know, take care of the body. It's the same thing with photography studios. So you're not just looking for the studio. You're looking for the person who makes the camera. You're looking for the people who make the film or the glass plates for the camera. You know, you're looking for all of those types of things. And in a lot of cases, it's just a furniture store. They're going down to the local furniture store to buy their furniture. But then I'm probably looking for newspaper ads. What are they advertising for sale? What type of furniture? Like, are they selling this chair? You know, where can I find it?
Sure. What about violins? Were those used as props? This person says they have a photo with a young man with a violin.
Typically you could, just like with telephones. Like you'll see a lot of photos in the late teens and early 20s with people holding phones. They probably had never seen a phone in their life, but they were like, this is so cool. So yes, it could have been a prop, but most likely the person who's holding the instrument plays that instrument. Sure. So there are certain features where you're going to be using personal items. So things like sports players, whether it's a baseball mitt or a football, golf clubs, any type of musical instrument, accordion, violin, you know, things like that. It's probably something that they already had, and they're having the photo taken to kind of commemorate that.
Sure. What resolution did you scan that grocery store interior shot at, and what size was the original print that was scanned?
The original print was actually 8x10, so it was fairly big, but I have different levels of scanning based on what I'm doing. So if I'm scanning a studio portrait and it's just a couple and there's not a lot of details, I'll scan at 300 DPI and save it as a TIFF file. Any photo you scan, you should save as a TIFF file, because JPEGs, every time they open and close, you lose little bits of in pieces. Eventually that image will fail. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. It's like you take a piece out every time. TIFF is uncompressible. So no matter how many times you open and close it, you're never going to lose any bits to it. And I use it as my archival platform. I convert them to JPEGs to share, post online, whatever I'm doing, but I have my master TIFF. That one I scanned at 1200, which is a huge file size, but it allowed me to really drill in. So if I'm doing like a class photo or a church photo or something where there's a lot of people, I'll scan it between 800 and 1200 so I can blow it up and see, do they have rings? Are they wearing glasses? Are their ears pierced? But it's going to be a huge file size. So the file size on that one is over 100 meg because I scanned it at such a high resolution. But for like everyday things or little 4x4 salt prints, you know, like 1940s style black and whites, I might only scan at 300. It depends on what I'm trying to get out of it.
When did having one's photo taken become affordable for the masses?
Right around the turn of the century, right around the 1910s and the teens. That's when you start to see Kodak producing individual brownie candid portrait type cameras. Studio portraits were very expensive, and not only were they costly, but the exposure times early on, pre-1900, could be up to a minute. That's why everybody looks so angry, because you're trying to like not move or sneeze or laugh or, you know, everybody's eyes look a little crazy because they're trying to stay still. But truly, it's Kodak, and there are other brands, but you know, that started selling those candids. So in the teens, like right about 1912, you're going to start to see a lot of those candid photos, and it became a lot more affordable. And then keep in mind too, after the First World War, we did hit a depression, and it, you know, we had a huge drop off, like 1918 to 1920, and it started to come up about 21, 22. You know, into what we know of as, you know, the heyday of the 1920s, the roaring 20s. So you'll see a lot of them in that era, 22 to 28 until the crash. And people still had their cameras. They just might not have been able to afford to develop them, or a lot of people did it at home. But you'll still see a lot of photos from the 30s and the 40s, you know, even with the Depression. So, but yeah, in the teens is probably when you'll see the most candids.
All right. The first photo you showed had a border. Is there an era of when that was used?
Oh, absolutely. So like I said, when you're dealing with really early 1850s era prints, it'll just be a plain solid, you know, nothing around the cardboard. You know, usually they're 2.5 by 3.5. By about 1858 to 1860, you'll have typically one red stripe. And then it'll go to 2 red stripes. And then you'll start to see gold. Rarely do you ever see blue. It must have been harder to make, but you'll see gold or you'll see red as your border. And then from there, after the Civil War, you'll start to see slightly more elaborate borders, and you'll start to get on the carte visites. They become bigger. Those are the 5x7s. You're getting 2 per sheet. Whereas with the tiny cards, like the calling card size, you might get 12 per sheet. But they'll start to get more elaborate, just like the backgrounds start to get more elaborate. And just like how the backing, you know, are they putting their photo mark on the front or on the back? Like, do they have an elaborate logo that they're starting to include? So it all evolves, you know, both simple backgrounds, simple framing, and it works its way up from there. And you'll get more elaborate frames in the UK before you get more elaborate frames in the US.
All right. Can you say again how to differentiate boys from girls in dresses in old photos?
Typically, boys will look more masculine. You'll have belts, you'll have pleats. It'll be more of a military style, so it'll be more of a triangular or square collar. You won't really get lacing or bows or anything like that. There's always an exception. But for the most part, it'll be, you know, they'll be more masculine looking. You'll have the pleats kind of give it away, and the belt definitely gives it away.
All right. Someone says they have a great uncle who was in World War I and was a Boy Scout leader. She has a picture of him in a uniform and a campaign hat. How do I tell which organization the picture is from?
I would start comparing it to other photos. So whether if you go to the Library of Congress, National Archives, First World War Museum, they have a lot of photos online. So you can kind of look at some of these photos to say, oh, it looks more like that, less like this. And just start comparing. In your handout also, I give you like Shorpy and there's one other one in there, Retronaut, which are really great if it's like, I need images of bicycles, or I need images of 1930s bathing suits, to just kind of compare and see what matches up. And you could also send it to these organizations too. You could send the photo to the First World War Museum in Kansas City and say, do you recognize this? Can you tell me what division it is? National Archives will do the same thing. If you reach out to their history hub, if you contact them, they could help identify it also.
Yeah. How frequently did studios supply the apparel worn by subjects, and how does that complicate analysis?
Historically, I don't think they did. I think people came in their best outfits because they wanted to show, they wanted to commemorate an event, whether it was a wedding, whether it was a funeral, whether it was a sibling you haven't seen in 30 years coming in from out of town. I think it's more of a modern mid 20th to late 20th century phenomenon to play dress up, so to speak. I don't really see that pre 1900. People are wearing items that they already had in their possession.
Mm-hmm. How did the everyday family afford to have a photo taken, and is that why they usually only had one family photo taken in the studio?
Truly, I mean, you can really kind of get a gauge of what somebody's worth based on whether or not, like, the tax stamps, whether or not they can afford to buy an entire album. A lot of times you're just buying a single photo. You might save up for it. But I would say the average person probably was able to afford getting photos taken maybe once or twice a year, just on average. Of course, you're always going to have people who aren't possibly going to be able to do that. So like, there's not a whole lot of photos from my family. I've only ever seen a handful of them because they were, poor Irish immigrants living on the south side of Chicago. So the only photos I have of that era are their, not confirmation, their christening of the girls in their christening dresses. Those are the only photos I have of them. So I have 4 out of 5. One of them probably had a photo and it just got lost over time, but those are the only childhood photos I have. So you're going to have people who it's got to be really important to be able to do it. But for most people, you could usually do it maybe once or twice a year. I would go through the newspapers. I would see how much the photography studio was charging for prints because they would advertise that, come and get a photo taken for XYZ, and then compare that against the census that's telling me how much my family's worth at that particular time. How much money do they have in the bank? Kind of get a feel for whether or not they could have afforded to have done it.
Yeah. And you have to wonder, what did they do with the photos? Maybe they sent them to other family members and you haven't just collected them all from all the different branches that would have received a copy of the photo or, additional photos. So
yeah, like with the photo I showed earlier of, the young lady who had died shortly after childbirth, there were 4 photos of her because she had 2 kids. So they each had one. And then her husband probably had one and her family probably had one. Mm-hmm. And then over time, they just all passed down through the family to the same person, and they had 3 out of 4 of them.
Yeah. What was the significance, if any, of a scalloped edge on a photo?
Nothing really, just preference. It's kind of like if you order things from Shutterfly or Tiny Prints, they ask you what kind of edge do you want. I think it's just you're going to pay a little bit more, so maybe you're showing that you've got a little bit more wealth to be able to afford the fancy versus just the plain edge.
Yeah. Do you have a solution for getting the mildew smell off of old photos that were stored in a damp basement?
Mildew is definitely a challenge. I teach a class on preserving family heirlooms, and I kind of talk about that a little bit. There are solutions to that. You never want to put anything on because they're cardboard, and cardboard is one of the lowest forms of paper that's out there. It's the least treated. Think of how a cardboard box versus a archival white sheet of paper. Some things that you could do is, you can put it, like you can take, I don't have one handy, but you could take like a Tupperware container and you can put another little box in it and set the photo on it and like sprinkle baking soda around to kind of take out some of the smell. Don't ever sprinkle it on it because you don't want to scrape it because it's abrasive, but near it so that it can kind of absorb that. You think about it. We sprinkle baking soda in our shoes. It really does a good job of taking the smell out, but there's not really a great way to eliminate mildew unless you're going to treat it. And cold treatments can do that, but if it's not something that you're trained to do, I wouldn't just stick it in my freezer and expect that it's going to solve the problem, because you're going to run into more problems than you're going to run into solutions. But if you're really just trying to get rid of the smell, I'd probably put it near some baking soda.
Yeah. What do you suggest for converting slides to digital?
You can do it. There are programs out there. There's a device called Wolf, that you kind of push it through and it scans each image. They only do them as JPEGs. They don't do them as TIFF files though, so you're not getting a great quality image. Some scanners will do it. I have an Epson V600 that comes with a slide holder. I can clip it in and I can scan them and then convert them. So there are technologies out there that you can do yourself. Otherwise, there's plenty of companies out there. You know, there's iPhoto, there's lots of different companies that can scan those slides and convert them to digital for you.
Yeah. When were the daguerreotypes common?
You'll start to see them from, like, the first photography is done in 1844, you know, but you won't start to see that in the States roughly until 1846, 1848. What's cool about it is that the American Revolution Museum in Philadelphia, at the very end of the exhibit is a whole wall of enlargements of daguerreotypes of revolutionaries that had survived, you know, to 1848, 1850. They're fascinating. But they're really very popular from like the late 1840s to about 1858, 1860. Ambrotypes, there's another word I'm drawing a blank on at the moment. And then they move into tintypes. And then from tintypes, they move in, they always had the cabinet cards, but then they move from the tintypes away from that to cyanotypes and cabinet cards, and then black and white, and then color. But 1850s, if you've got daguerreotypes, I would easily start with the 1850s and move forward or backward.
Do you have any tips on identifying photos from Norway?
Same process. You're going to do the same thing. You're going to try to see if you can identify a photographer's mark. You're going to try to see if you can identify the clothing styles, the hat styles, the backgrounds, exact same thing. It wouldn't matter where it was in the world. You're still looking for those same features. And you're using the same resources. You're looking for newspapers, city directories, postal directories in those countries as well.
Perfect. Can you comment on the large photos in oval frames and convex glass? What time period are they? And they said they're so large, I would imagine expensive and special occasions only.
Yeah, I have two of them. They both date from like the mid 1880s, the ones that I have. I can't give you an exact date on the range of those, but I would probably say same thing, 1885 to 1895. Ours were wedding photos. So it's the groom and the bride kind of in those great big, and on those, they're actually kind of fascinating because they would do a lot of hand painting. So like the cheeks are hand painted red, you know, so they've got some touch-ups that are being done on the photo as well. They're kind of cool. They almost look like chalk prints that are in that era, mid 1880s, 1890s.
I think I have one more question unless more come through. This is kind of a funny one, but they're wondering if the T on your wall is for Mary Tyler Moore, but I think it's because Tina, T for Tina, right?
Tina, but it's for Tamarack too. So yeah, and above it is my tree of life, which is the symbol for my company. So I have
Cool. I love seeing people's backgrounds too. You have a very nice one. I just have a plain one because I'm in the temporary space in the library right now. So
yeah, so tree of life, I've got a ton of tree of life kind of scattered throughout my office.
All right, well, one more came through here. Someone says, I have an 8th grade graduation class photo of my grandmother, which was probably taken in 1896. There are about 20 to 25 students in the photo. All of the girls are wearing white dresses except for her grandmother and one other girl who were wearing dark dresses. Is this an indication there was a death in the family?
Usually children weren't held to the same standards that adults were held to, but that's a very good question. I don't have an answer for that. But what I would do is I would probably start investigating. So I'd be looking through newspapers to see, you know, if potentially there could have been a death. But I'd be looking at the style of dress too. Does it look like it could potentially be a morning dress? Does it look like it's made out of crepe? You know, or does it just look like it's heavy wool and she forgot that it was photo day, which potentially could have happened also. But yeah, I'd probably be looking through the newspaper to see if there's a graduation listing, because they wouldn't just list high school graduations. They would list lower class promotions as well, and see if there's an inventory of all those students as well. But yeah, I don't have an answer, but I'm very curious now if they just forgot or if there was something going on.
Yeah. Then one more question came through about how do you convert JPEG to TIFF, or can you convert JPEG to TIFF, or would you do it vice versa?
You should always go TIFF to JPEG, but you can convert from a JPEG back up to a TIFF file, but it's not going to fix the damage that was already done to it. So if you've opened that photo 100 times, you've already lost a little bit of data, but what you could do is then you've got a copy. So it would be a slightly larger file size. It wouldn't be as big of a file size as if it were born digital as a TIFF, like that's how you created it and stepped it down to a JPEG. But it'd be the same process. You would just do it in reverse. So like the easiest way to do it is I open up Paint, the Paint program on your computer, Microsoft Paint. And if you go to Paint, you have the ability in the drop-down menu to save as. And once you save as, you can change the file format. So then I can save it as a TIFF or save it as a GIF or save it as a PNG or however. You can do it if you have Photoshop, but a lot of people don't have Photoshop. So Paint is free on almost every computer if you've got a PC. So you can create them that way as well. But in Photoshop too, or some other softwares are where you can mirror if you have tintypes and you can flip them as well. So you've got it the correct direction, but you can, it just won't, it won't really change how many times you've opened the other one.
And then we had one more asking about where to find class lists. And we actually had a great presentation back in July on school records. So I'm going to put the YouTube link for that in the chat for everybody if you want to take a look at that and learn more about how to find school records and researching your ancestors and trying to find how you can identify those photos that you might have of their school.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, those were all the questions. Thank you again, Tina. This was an amazing presentation. There were so many wonderful comments in the chat about how excellent of a presentation this was and how they were so appreciative of all the knowledge that you've shared, and they're so excited to work on their photos and identifying. So again, thank you so much. And
thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope to see you next month. Again, November 12th is our next presentation, and we'll be talking about Native American ancestors with Paula Stewart Warren as our speaker. So,
well, thank you all so much. I appreciate it. Thank you for hosting. Thank you for being on. Tell me if you go through it and you're like, oh my God, this is so-and-so, tell me. Nobody ever tells me the good news. Like, I want to hear what you find, who you identify. I want to hear all of your good news. Yeah. So by all means, let me know. And my email address is on the handout. So if you have questions about specifics, email me at any time. But Perfect. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Take care.